So my talk will be mainly about some work that we've done in my lab and also in collaboration with Semantic Scholar at AI2, mainly focusing on knowledge extraction from unstructured scientific text. We have enormous amount of textual data available in many different forms. For example, we have textual paragraphs, we have a collection of articles, or even a larger collection coming from Wikipedia that probably we can call them semi-structured. We have data in a structured form, for example, in Wikidata or in scientific knowledge bases, even in conjunction with other modalities such as visual data and, for example, diagrams, and also a large collection of scientific documents. So the question of how we can make sense of this large amount of data is a big challenge in NLP and also in a lot of other AI applications. In particular, it's really important to make sense of scientific data because we have a really large collection of scientific articles, and this increased a lot over the past year with the surge of a lot of COVID-19 articles. For example, COVID-19 corpus in AI2 has about 500K documents to date, and only like 100K of them were in 2020. As you see, we have a really big growth in increasing the number of scientific articles. But they are super useful for us. We can imagine that this scientific literature is actually a huge database of scientific problems, solutions, and findings that a lot of researchers have shown us. So it's really important to make sense of this large amount of scientific data. In particular, we are interested in addressing this problem in NLP and also importantly in scientific text of comprehending them and being able to reason about them. I have divided this problem into 4 kind of sub-problems that are kind of sometimes competing with each other, sometimes complementary. One is retrieval, like how can we find useful information among this large collection of scientific data, comprehend them and make sense of, for example, what things are mentioned in a piece of text, not necessarily the large collection of them, but even like within sections. How can we organize and maintain the knowledge that we are extracting from these type of scientific data? And finally, how can we integrate these different pieces of evidence and reason about them? So this is kind of the focus of research in my lab. We're trying to make some progress in each of these directions. And here I'm mainly gonna focus about the knowledge extraction part. In order to do knowledge extraction and also comprehension and reasoning, many different areas of AI need to kind of integrate and talk to each other. In particular, we need to be able to represent the knowledge, make progress in NLP, computer vision, and machine learning algorithms. So it's really important to build these different components that they all talk to each other such that we can have a fully fledged textual comprehension and reasoning approaches. And it's really important to be able to evaluate our progress in comprehension and reasoning by, for example, devising several applications of how we can say, now we've come up with good understanding of these type of scientific documents. One important application that we've introduced with collaboration of AI2 researchers is in fact-checking and rationale extraction. In particular, we are interested in addressing a problem like this, that given a scientific claim, like ACE2 receptors are involved in coronavirus infection, we would like to find a rationale sentence that kind of justifies if this claim is correct or not, like patients treated with this drug experience a reduction in symptoms. And in order to find this claim or this rationale that tries to verify this claim, we basically need to understand and analyze a large research corpus together with the scientific background knowledge or our knowledge bases to understand if this claim is correct or not. So I'm kind of building the basics for mentioning that it's important to build knowledge extraction and kind of reasoning systems. Okay. What is a common practice in AI, especially in NLP? Most of you are familiar with that. Basically, the idea is we take the context. It can be Wikipedia, it can be Freebase, it can be scientific article, or and so on and so forth. We basically take this, pass it to one of our favorite Sesame Street character models, one of the pre-trained language models, encode this text, and then fine-tune it on the end task that we are excited about. Like, for example, in question answering, for example, we focus on phrase extraction. And like fact verification, we focus on true or false classification of the claims, right? So this works really awesome in many standard NLP tasks. But now the question is, what about scientific text, right? So the focus on a lot of NLP tasks, like a standard NLP task in general domain, is that we build large scale task specific data sets that allow us to do this last layer of fine tuning, like basically this part of building these kind of very strong models that can address the final task for us. But how about the scientific papers? We know we have a lot of them, but the important challenge is how can we make larger scale data sets, or are there even available for us, right? So annotation is super challenging, and as I'm describing in this talk, we are not able to build larger scale data sets. It requires expert annotations, and it's much harder than like crowdsourcing annotations that a lot of other NLP tasks are doing these days. In addition, these scientific papers include a lot of technical terms, which we call them unknown vocabulary, or out of domain vocabulary for a lot of pre-trained language models. So how can we enable our current language models to be aware of these type of technical terms? So these are really important challenges in the scientific domain. Here, I'm going to talk about two research directions that my group is pursuing. One is understanding scientific papers by extracting knowledge about them. And the other is claim verification and kind of being able to evaluate reasoning capabilities of different algorithms. Okay, first work in scientific knowledge extraction. We have done a series of work on this, and I'm kind of presenting the last one, which is how we build a general purpose knowledge extraction system. But allow me to first introduce what do I mean by scientific knowledge extraction. Overall, we are interested in extracting important entities and concepts from text, their relationships, and also kind of the more complex relationships in the form of events. More concretely, we want to extract, for example, what are the tasks and methods that are being introduced in this paper, right? So for example, what are the tasks, like scientific information extraction is a task that we've addressed in this paper. And then how these things are related with each other. Like, for example, one specific method is being used for a specific task, right? Or what is the data set that is being used for this particular task? Like, there are different types of relationships that exist among these important scientific concepts. Here, we introduced DIG, our unified multitask learning framework for knowledge extraction. We introduced data sets in scientific domain, both for the purpose of fine-tuning our task and also evaluating how well the model perform on these tasks, including data in scientific domain, computer science domains, and also COVID-19. And finally, we show the use case of this knowledge extraction system in building a knowledge base for COVID-19 mechanisms. Okay. So our general framework has kind of three main important things. One is it's a multitask learning framework that kind of jointly identifies entities, relations, and co-references, and also events. It achieves the state-of-the-art results in several tests and several benchmarks, including scientific data as well as in general domain. And the important research question that we were trying to address here was how we can take full advantage of the smaller scale annotated data that is available in technical and scientific domain, where annotations is very expensive. Okay, so we know information extraction overall is challenging. We've seen great progress in the general domain, but it's even more challenging in scientific domain, even beyond a limited data annotation. Let's look at this example, which comes from biomedical data. The important challenge here is that there are a lot of overlapping and nested entities within a sentence. For example, IL-2 is a name of a protein, and then this kind of this whole phrase of IL-2 gene promoter region is actually a DNA name, right? So these entities are basically nested here. And also we have another example here. T cell is a cell type, and then we have a bigger entity, which is a cell line. This is an important challenge, and it kind of causes issues for previous standard kind of information extraction techniques that were using sequence tagging. Another important challenge is long-range dependencies between different entities when we want to extract relationships. So here, as you see, we have three different entities like in three consecutive sentences. One introducing these CCRs, then after that we're referring to them as their co-references, like as a pronoun or their acronyms. But we are breaking sentences into kind of simpler sentences to show different relationships, and therefore these relationships are across different sentences, not just within one sentence. So how can we tackle these large, long-range dependencies to find extracted relation? Okay, and this way we require cross-sentence context. Okay, our model DIGI is kind of trying to push for this. The modeling idea is that instead of representing text and forming the knowledge extraction as a sequence tagging problem, we form it as classifying text spans. Okay, I'm gonna explain it in more details in the next slides. And then we later show how we can build good span representations using the information that we are getting across sentences within one paragraph, through co-reference links and also through the relation links, such that this better representation enable us to do a better job in entity relation and event extraction. Okay, so here is how the model works. We have sentences like this. Then we pass them to one of our pre-trained language model, basically the contextual encoding layer. Then we enumerate important spans within sentences, right? So we have a spans like where we define a span as a sequence of tokens within a sentence. Like things like this paper summarizes, CCRs are Boolean, and so on. Okay, so we enumerate all possible spans. We used some heuristics not to kind of overdo it, but we looked at sequences of tokens with like n tokens within sentences. Okay, then the important step is how we encode phrases when we only have token encoding. So how do we do that? First, we basically concatenate the start and end token representations to represent one phrase. But then we would like to update phrase representations according to co-reference information that exists within a paragraph. Okay, basically we have represented a graph for how these different phrases are related to each other. Now let's see how we update the encoding of a phrase like there. We basically look at the potential mention antecedents that potentially are co-referred with this phrase there, like CCR and the category co-occurrence restriction. Then we update the representation of this bigger phrase there through this co-reference link. How? Very simply, we basically update its embedding by weighted average, linear weighted average of the previous phrases. Okay, it's kind of very similar to kind of graph and neural graph encoding approaches here. And now the encoding of the phrase there is getting updated from its antecedents like CCR and category co-occurrence restriction. Okay. And we are doing it n times, so kind of we are doing multiple rounds of this message passing, so the phrase kind of representation is getting updated. And then we like to update the encoding of each phrase according to the relationships that each phrase is at. Okay, so for example, we want to update the representation of a phrase like this algorithm, and we know it is being used for syntactic descriptions, right? So basically the idea is the encoding of syntactic descriptions should kind of inform the encoding of this algorithm. We do the same process. Basically, we do weighted average over the things that are related, and we are doing it several times for several iterations. Okay, and for relations, at this point, we are basically doing it within context to avoid like a really, to deal with the scalability. Okay, same thing for events. We know events include kind of n-ary relations, and then we do the same type of message passing to update the encoding of phrases within events. Like the encoding of things like this paper will be updated according to the to the phrases that it's being related to. Okay. So all this would enable building a more kind of contextual phrase representations, which is kind of being shared across all the tasks that we are pursuing from now on. Basically, now we want to classify these phrases to see if they are important entities or not. This is pretty simple. We train feed-forward networks and realize, for example, CCRs are kind of scientific entities and build these classifiers. In parallel, we train classifiers for relationships where we take a pair of phrases and see if they are related with each other or not. And if they are, what is their relation type? Same thing for events and co-references. Okay. So I'm seeing a lot of things in the chat. Am I supposed to answer these questions, or I keep the questions?
Hannah, you can keep going and we can have a discussion at the end of your talk.
Sounds good. Okay. Yeah, because I couldn't read all the detailed messages, but sounds good. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So now we started this kind of multi-layer network of starting with token encoding, phrase encoding, graph propagations, and then finally the final task layer, which are kind of doing all these different tasks. Just to summarize, our DIG model uses BERT encoding. We had the earlier versions that were built on LSTMs and Elmo embeddings, like older days in 2018. And we showed that our DIG framework can be applied in different domains if we have a smaller scale annotations of entities, relations, and events. And the good news is that we have the implementation available in Allen NLP, in PyTorch, and also the earlier version was available in TensorFlow. Good. So the thing that I've showed you was how we can build a model that takes a scientific abstract here and extracts a knowledge graph out of it, right? A smaller scale knowledge graph. But on the other hand, we are interested in building larger scale knowledge graphs by kind of connecting these different pieces of a smaller scale knowledge to kind of build a domain specific knowledge graph. In particular, we've done it for the computer science domain and also in COVID-19. In particular, our COVID-19 knowledge graph exists of 1.5 million relations. where we extract the relationships where we are highly confident about them. Good. How can we train our DIG? Still, we need some annotations. In particular, we have done some annotations in computer science and also in COVID-19. In the computer science domain, this is how it works. This is one annotation example that we are getting a scientific abstract. One or a few of CS grad students actually started annotating and extracting entities that are important concepts. We have 6-7 different types of entities in our schema, and also 6 or 7 different types of relations, how these things are related to each other, things like used for, hyponym of, and so on. And this is kind of how the annotation works. To leverage the cross-sentence relationships, we introduced co-reference links. So kind of now we are able to handle cross-sentence relationships. This is annotated for 500 AI abstracts, and we have annotations for all these 3 tasks. We are interested to showcase the use case of DIG in multiple domains, in particular in our SciERC, which is the computer science abstracts that we just talked about. In Genia, which is a data set already existed in molecular biology abstracts, wet lab protocols also annotated by some other groups, and in a general newswire and online forum texts, ACE 2005. And here are our results and named entity recognition. The lighter blue is a state-of-the-art before DIG, which was also one of our models using the LSTM and ELMO. And then DIG uses the kind of the whole framework of graph propagation and everything. And as you can see, we see improvement over the previous approach, and in particular in the scientific domain. Also in relation extraction, and again, as you see, the bigger boosts come in the scientific domain. And then also in event improvements, especially in event trigger detection. This is a sample knowledge graph we've extracted in the computer science domain. We weren't sure how to visualize it, so I'm kind of showing you a snapshot of the system. That this whole thing is around a statistical machine translation, and these are different relationships that are related to it. I don't know if you can read it, but some important relations are: it is evaluated by word error rate or rouge or meteor and so on. We compare it with NMT and MT. In conjunction with ASR, it is used for retrieval, translation, search, and uses segmentation, maximum entropy, word sense disambiguation. Like most of them, pretty precise. As I said, we made sure to select highly confident relations rather than we pushed for precision rather than recall when we were building this knowledge graph. Okay. An important use case of our approach was in extracting a knowledge base of mechanisms in from COVID-19 papers. This is in collaboration with a lot of folks at AI2, led by my student Ida and also Tom at AI2. And this paper just presented, I would say, yesterday at NACO. So what is the big challenge in the COVID-19 domain? There is a really important challenge going on here, which is it is hugely interdisciplinary. We have a lot of papers in COVID-19 with a lot of areas, research areas being involved: physics, chemistry, engineering, mathematics, computer science, even economics, and so on. For example, we have sentences like this in the papers, like simulation models examining effects of ventilation and dynamics of SARS-CoV-2, or AI algorithms used for drug design, or economic impacts on prices, consumption, and so on. So when I was explaining our previous work in computer science domain, what we mainly did was to annotate a smaller scale data for CS domain, right? Where we could say we have things like tasks, methods, and relations. But it's very hard to do same thing in the COVID-19 domain, where we are dealing with this such interdisciplinary source of concepts and topics. Instead, our solution was to define mechanism relations, where we define mechanisms as some sort of abstraction of this scientific language, right? And in particular, it shows the causal relations, the functions, the mechanistic activities, and their interactions, right? And if you can think of it, the notion of mechanisms has existed in science for a long time. We are basically borrowing that idea and mentioning that a lot of things that we are seeing in COVID-19, most of it are basically some sort of mechanisms, right? This way, we are able to build a unified language for representing these type of relationships. It is broad, it is generalizable to a lot of different domains. At the same time, it is expressive and informative, but it's kind of more fine-grained that completely be open scale, like open information extraction. And we could explain it and define it for our annotators, where they were expert in kind of CS and biomedical, and they could annotate a lot of data for us this way. Okay, so here is our approach overview. We selected some papers from Cohort 19 corpus of COVID-19 papers. We asked our annotators to annotate mechanisms for some of those papers. I think we did it for about 200 abstracts. Then we trained our DIG model on these abstracts, on these annotated abstracts, and then combine and integrate them, basically very same line of work, to build a large scale knowledge base of COVID-19 mechanisms, and then did advanced semantic relation search to answer some queries. So let me show some of our experiments here, basically. First of all, here is our data set that includes 2,000 annotated relations, hugely interdisciplinary. We have relations, as we expected, we have relations in CS, math, engineering, all the way to virology and microbiology. This is our end knowledge base, which is the COVID-19 mechanism knowledge base, which includes about 1.5 million relations. And we also built a search interface for extracting these relations. In particular, our search interface is something like this, that a user is supposed to enter one entity or two entities, and the potential relationship that they are interested about extracting. And then we show them important kind of occurrences of co-occurrences of these entities in our knowledge base, and also show them their corresponding scientific papers. For example, some queries could ask about deep learning and drugs, or heat and SARS-CoV-2, and so on. Okay. We evaluated our DIG model, first of all, to see how accurate the model is in our annotated data. Basically, the idea is kind of similar to what we did in the computer science domain. We get a scientific document as input, and the output is the extracted entities and also their relationships. This figure at right shows the precision at K for different K values. And we compared DIG, the blue line, with kind of some baseline, and the DIG that is trained on our data, the blue line, with some other baseline. And as you can see, our method is has a really high precision, which was to our benefit because it enabled us to build a really highly accurate and highly precise knowledge base. We also wanted to evaluate the utility of the extracted knowledge base. We did it in two ways. The first one was we pre-designed some queries, like the ones that you see in these yellow boxes, like can coronavirus live in warm climates, or applications of AI in COVID-19, right? And the search was basically passing two entities like coronavirus and warm climates, and also subfields of AI and kind of empty entity to show like if there are some things like that. And then we had a few annotators to evaluate the extracted relations. And as you see, and this curve basically shows precision and recall curve. And as you see, like it's a really interesting and well-formed precision recall curve, showing we are highly precise even under high recall, which was really good. Especially for the blue line that shows the, like when we have both of the entities around, like even the method is more precise. The last experiment, which I think that was the most interesting one, was to use our method, basically train on COVID-19 data. And then kind of we did this zero-shot generalization of running it on a collection of biomedical papers and compare it with PubMed, okay? And then we did some study with 5 physicians to evaluate the quality of extracted relations, right? And we were searching for some of these causal relationships. And remember, PubMed is the go-to kind of tool for MDs when they want to search the relevant literature. And interestingly, we observed that in terms of all metrics like search, utility, and interface, they prefer our knowledge base with respect to the PubMed knowledge base. And even interestingly, they preferred us in terms of interface. That was very surprising to us because we really didn't spend too much time on doing interface design. But we believe one reason was we were kind of showing where we are extracting these relations, and also in the context of the scientific papers, that was super helpful for them. These are some samples that I also talked about during this part of the talk. Definitely encourage you to go to our demo and kind of even type your own queries here. Some examples, again, warm climate and coronavirus, COVID-19, and grounded glass opacities, and so on. Okay, so I think I have a few more minutes. I also want to talk a little bit about our second line of work on scientific claim verification. This project was also led by my amazing student, Dave Wadden, and also in collaboration with AI2 researchers. Basically, here is the challenge in scientific claim verification. Remember this sentence I mentioned at the beginning. ACE2 receptors are involved in coronavirus infection. We know this rationale sentence kind of supports this claim, but in order to actually understand this works, we really need to kind of do multi-hop reasoning to follow that. First of all, we require some sort of scientific background knowledge to know that this drug actually disrupts ACE2 function. We need to have some statistical and numerical understanding knowledge that P is smaller than 0.01 means that it is statistically significant. We need to have NLP models able to deal with this long-range context. We know that this sentence talked about some patients that have reduction in symptoms, but what patients, right? We are talking about coronavirus. But earlier in the article, we saw that these patients had COVID-19 symptoms. And then finally, some sort of cause and effect where if disrupting ACE2 reduces symptoms, then ACE2 is involved in infection, and all of these would result that this rationale actually supports this scientific claim. Okay. So how do we do that? Again, we annotated smaller scale data for scientific fact verification. We defined this task and developed some baseline models. And also we verified real world claim. And I know we have seen a lot of improvement throughout this shared task of this workshop on this task. Overall, in previous work in fact-checking, people have looked at natural claims versus synthetic claims, which is pretty important to focus on natural claims, because synthetic claims, people like different models can get and leverage the dataset biases. But overall, it's really challenging to build and collect natural claims. In particular, it is more challenging in the science domain because we need our experts to sit down, write down a few kind of claims. But we observe something super useful here, that citation sentences are a useful resource for us because they are kind of summarizing a claim mentioned in some other paper that we basically use them as a source of sentences about like claim sentences. And this is how we build our SciFact data set. We look at the citing paper, we look at the citation sentence, we simplify this such that the sentence, like these claims, are atomic. And then we looked at the cited papers, find out where they are, like if they are supporting or refuting the claim, and also like what sentence is actually talking about this claim, and highlight those as a rationale. In comparison with the previous data sets, like in general domain, our domain is biomedicine, the claims are natural. We have 1.4K, which is quite a small compared to 185K in the fever data set, but the claims are synthetic over there. Compared to kind of natural claims in political news, this scale kind of is reasonable. We define this task where we take the claim. The goal is to build a claim verification system that finds an abstract that is relevant to this claim, find the rationale sentences that are potentially supporting or refuting a claim. The modeling pipeline, we are following kind of a simple pipeline here. We first do abstract retrieval, retrieve the relevant claims, relevant abstracts, select rationale using BERT, and then select the important sentences, label prediction, and label if it is supports or refutes. Our results are promising, but we were showing that there is still a room to improve. And again, as I see here, we are seeing a lot of improvement in this task here in this workshop. Our first observation is that for a given abstract, when the abstracts are given to us, the system is doing a pretty good job when we are using fever as our kind of pre-training task. But for the task of both rationale extraction and also label classification, the improvement is less. And the full pipeline, we were seeing about 46.5% in this task. And in all those cases, we saw that if we just train the model on fever, the blue curves, the performance is not that high. But then when we fine tune it on our model, we see higher gains. Okay. Finally, we verified our task in real world claims. How much time do I have? I'm wondering.
Hannah, if you could finish up in a minute or two, we'll still have a couple minutes for questions.
Sounds good. So here also we have some demos. Definitely try it out. We have evaluated our SciFact system on about 40 COVID-related claims and verified the system. We showed that the system is able to have reasonable results, at least in 60% of these claims. Here is some other example I'm passing on, which is good, but this is something very helpful. We've added this user feedback button that we like other people or kind of researchers use our system, give us feedback about how well our system is able to verify claims. An important point for future work, which I like to mention, is for some claims like this, COVID-19 is a biological weapon, right? Our system is able to verify this claim and says and believes it can support it. But The reason is we found an article, like the system found an article, that in this article it says about 94% of respondents believe COVID-19 is a biological weapon, right? So a really important future direction is how can we verify the credibility of the source, right? So now, given some source, we are able to say, or current systems are able to say if this claim is supported or refuted, but how we can kind of deal with this misinformation, or as I'm saying, there are a lot of papers being published. How can we realize the quality of these papers? So what is next? There are two important directions that I can imagine here, and we are pushing on those. How can we make improvements in zero-shot or few-shot setting? In most of the work you've seen here, we've annotated even smaller scale data to deal with knowledge extraction or even scientific fact checking. But how can we build systems that don't require this much of data annotation? Should we bring in domain-specific pre-trained language models? Should we have better document representations? Should we incorporate domain-specific knowledge bases that exist in the literature? So these are important questions that we are not sure. I would love the community work on these directions. There are a lot of diverse and multi-hop reasoning challenges in the scientific domain. How can we build algorithms focusing on that direction? And also, how can we push for kind of this misinformation or source credibility in the scientific domain? Okay, thanks a lot.